My anger had cooled somewhat as I entered the lobby of our hotel located on Chicago's Gold Coast. It had passed from white-hot rage to a simmering anger as I glanced around the lobby. A faint hope that Linda had either changed her mind or was waiting to surprise me and laugh at how I had been taken in by her practical joke. Of course, neither event happened. A glance at the clock over the front desk reminded me that it was early, not even 11 o'clock yet. Rather than walk straight ahead towards the bank of elevators, I made a sharp right and entered the near-empty bar. The bartender had only just set my old-fashioned in front of me when I noticed the woman walk towards the bar and take a seat. She appeared to be in her late 20s and walked in confidently, her head held high. Her raven-colored hair was styled in a chignon, her red lips and flawless skin radiating a sophisticated appeal. She wore a form-fitting dress in a deep purple velvet with long sleeves that left her shoulders bare. She wore a black velvet choker centered with an ivory silhouette. Her only other adornment was a gold watch with a slim gold band. She glanced around the room before taking a seat at the bar. Unbidden, the bartender placed a glass of white wine before the woman. A working woman, I thought to myself, but definitely high-end. The woman glanced around the bar, her eyes passing over me but then coming back to rest on me as she noticed my frank stare. She tilted her head slightly to one side as if silently asking, "Yes? No? Maybe?" As I looked at her, an idea popped into my head. An idea so outrageous that, if I followed through, would give Linda not just a taste of her own medicine but would completely devastate her in much the same way I felt devastated. I left my seat and walked around the bar to approach the woman. "May I?" I asked, pointing to the empty bar stool beside her. "Of course," she replied. In addition to being drop-dead gorgeous, she had the most attractive accent which, to my untrained ear, sounded French. I stuck out my hand and she reciprocated, shaking with a firm grip. "I'm Jim Williams," I said. "Ellen Fontaine," she replied with a slight head nod. "Please, don't think me forward," I began, "but you appear to be in search of companionship this evening." She gave me an appraising look. "You are offering up this companionship?" "Yes, but not in the manner in which you're thinking." "And what am I thinking?" Ellen asked. "You think I'm just another out-of-town gentleman wanting to pay you for your time. But if that is not who you are, Jim Williams, then who are you?" "I'm someone who is willing to pay you a good amount of money for something that will not take much of your time." "How much money, and what would you have me do to earn this money?" I shrugged my shoulders. $5,000 for 4 to 5 hours of your time tomorrow?" Ellen gave me a surprised look. "Tomorrow? Not tonight?" I shook my head sadly as I replied, "I'm too upset to even think about companionship tonight. Truthfully, I may not even be ready tomorrow, but I have to do something to regain my self-respect." I could feel the tears spring to my eyes and start to track down my cheeks. Ellen grasped my forearm, a concerned look on her face. She pulled me off the bar stool and led me towards a table in the corner. She went back for our drinks and then, upon taking her seat, leaned forward and gave me an earnest look. "What happened to you, Jim?" I told her the whole story, starting with my nearly 10-year marriage to Linda, our kids, and building a new house that would be our forever home and into which we had moved last year. Then, how horrible February had been and how tonight was a chance for us to reconnect. I told her about Linda's blue dress and how amazing she looked in it, how she promised all her dances to me. I told her how Marc Lavaliere had swooped in and taken her away to dance, and how Linda had gone without even a backward glance at me, how she had conspired with one of her friends to sneak out the back door and leave with Lavaliere, how she expected me to be waiting at home for her when she got back from her once-in-a-lifetime experience, how our friends were all aware of what happened and had laughed about it, laughed at me. Ellen was appalled. "That is the most disrespectful thing I have ever heard of a wife doing." Ellen shook her head in disbelief. "Obviously, you have a plan for revenge that includes me. What is your plan?" As I explained my plan, her smile faded. "I think she will be very angry with you. It may be the end of your marriage if you follow through with this plan." I nodded in agreement. "It could be the end. Our marriage is probably over anyway. I just want her to get a taste of what she put me through tonight." "I don't go home with strangers," Ellen said. I think your plan will not succeed if I do not go to your home, and I do not go to the home of men I do not know. I nodded my head in agreement. Yes, for my plan to work, you must go to my home. How about this? I'll send you $2,500 right now. You can also take a photo of my driver's license. You go home and research me as much as you want. I have a pretty large online footprint due to my work, so I'll be easy to research. I'm not on social media, but my wife Linda is, so you'll be able to verify everything I'm telling you. If you agree to help me, come to my house tomorrow morning and I'll send you the other half of your money and we can carry out my plan. Ellen smiled and nodded her head. I can live with that. But how do you know I will not just keep the $2,500 and not show up tomorrow? I looked Ellen in the eye. Is that the kind of thing I have to worry about with you? Ellen grinned and said, Not at all. Unlike your wife, I honor my commitments. It was nearly 1 a.m. when I entered the cold, empty husk of what had once been a happy home. I set my alarm for 8 and was asleep almost immediately. After showering and shaving, I made coffee and toast while contemplating my situation. Obviously, my marriage was over. There could be no coming back from Linda's actions, and if my plan went the way I hoped, there would be no forgiveness toward me on her part either. As 9 o'clock approached, I called Mrs. Porter and asked her if she could keep the kids a few hours longer as something had come up that required our attention. She was happy to keep Tommy and Emma for the rest of the day. I wandered into my home office and researched Illinois divorce and what I could expect. I was a consultant and worked from home and had not had to travel for work in years. Working from home had let me take on an outsized role in the parenting of Emma and Tommy. I was able to fix breakfast every morning and prepare their lunches before they left for school. In the afternoon, I was able to help them with their homework and cook dinner so that when Linda arrived, she had nothing to do but relax with a glass of wine. Her commute was 30 minutes each way on a good day, but 45 to 60 minutes was more the norm. She also frequently put in 45-50 hours a week. Until today, it had never occurred to me that she might be using that supposed overtime to cheat. From what I could read online, I stood an excellent chance of getting primary custody of our children, although due to the disparity in our income, I would probably be on the hook for some alimony. Promptly at 9 o'clock, I heard a car door slam, followed shortly thereafter by the front doorbell ringing. A glance out the window revealed a BMW parked in my driveway as I opened the front door and ushered Ellen into the house. She was dressed casually in a light yellow sundress and wearing white designer ballet flats. Her hair was worn down and held back with a headband that matched her dress. Even dressed casually, she was a knockout. "Your home is beautiful," she exclaimed as she looked around the entry. I gave her a quick tour of the house, explaining that we had only lived in it for a little over a year. This was supposed to be our forever home, a place in which our children could grow and come back to visit with their children. Linda and I often spoke about how wonderful it would be to be retired and have a house full of grandkids to spoil. I could hear the bitterness in my voice as I said, she took all that away. She'd destroyed that dream without a moment's hesitation. "Oh, Jim, I am so sorry for your pain. You must try to reconcile with your wife. If we do as you plan, there may be no way back for the two of you." I shook my head and continued the tour. The tour ended in what Linda called the main bedroom, but which I still referred to as the master bedroom, despite my wife's gentle chiding of me. Old habits are hard to break, but hard does not mean impossible. Linda and I had long been in the habit of showing each other our love for one another, so yeah, habits are easier for some people to break than they are for others. "Have a seat on the bed and I'll get it," I said as I left to go to my home office. Our house was 2 stories, with the first floor containing a large family room, a more formal living room, the kitchen, the main bedroom, and my office. The kids' bedrooms, 2 guest rooms, and a large game room occupied the second floor. In my first floor office was a large, fireproof gun safe that measured 3x7. It did actually contain 1 pistol, a vintage piece that my great-grandfather had carried in the Army during WRI, however. The main reason for the existence of the safe was contained in a white garment bag hanging from a rod welded onto the rear wall of the safe. I grabbed the garment bag and returned with it to the bedroom and laid it on the bed. The bag was made of heavy white canvas and had tan leather piping around the edges. The top of the bag had been reinforced with the same leather to strengthen the bag when hanging. Due to being manufactured before the prevalence of zippers, there were a series of leather straps with buckles down the center of the bag to keep it closed. I unbuckled each of the straps and spread open the garment bag to reveal the white dress it contained. Linda's wedding dress. But not just any wedding dress. Ellen pulled the hangered dress out of the bag, casually glancing at the label as she did so. She let out a gasp and let the hanger slip from her hands. "Do you know what this is?" she asked incredulously. "I do. I'm the one who pays the homeowner's insurance. I have a special rider for that darned dress." "You did not tell me about this. I cannot help you with this," Ellen said, shaking her head in irritation. "Hear me out," I replied, raising my hands in what I hoped was a calming gesture as I prepared to sell her on the idea of helping me out. My parents had moved to our town on the North Shore outside of Chicago when I was in the 3rd grade. Linda's family, on the other hand, had lived in our town for generations. Linda's great-great-grandfather had been the president of the First National Bank in our town. This was decades before the advent of retail banking, which placed a bank branch at every strip shopping center in town and gave a bank manager the same level of prestige as a fast food manager. In the days of old, when a town only had 1 or 2 banks, the head of the bank was an important position in the community, and that man was one of the wealthiest men in town. So it had been with Linda's great-great-grandfather. When his only daughter became engaged, his wife and daughter took an ocean cruise from New York City to Southampton, England, and then a ferry from Portsmouth to Le Havre, France, and then traveled by train to Paris. In Paris, Linda's great-great-grandmother and great-grandmother had appeared by appointment at one of the most famous addresses in all of France, 31 Rue Cambon, the Salon of Coco Chanel. As Ellen ran her hand over the label, I gave a sardonic smile. To a generation of people who only knew of the backward and forward intertwined double C logo, seeing a different label would create a big red flag. Not for Ellen. At the hotel as we chatted, she told me her story. Born in Nice to well-educated and moderately wealthy parents, Ellen had moved to Paris to study fashion design. She had apprenticed at the very fashion house that so long ago had made the wedding dress she now held. Instead of the well-known double C, the label read Gabrielle Chanel. The L in Chanel ended with a sweeping loop that swooped back and underlined her name with a flare. Below the flare was the word Paris. There was a pocket sewn into the panel of the garment bag, and I took out the contents to show Ellen. The pocket contained the drawings and designs for the dress, all signed by Gabrielle Chanel. Also in the pocket was a receipt for the dress showing the price as $19.58. The top of the receipt said simply Chanel Boutique, and the address on Rue Cambon. Written across the face of the receipt were the words Entièrement payé, paid in full, and below that the signature of Gabrielle Chanel. At the shop, Madame Chanel herself had taken measurements and shown her drawings of the planned wedding dress to the delight of the mother and daughter pair. A deposit was made, a date decided upon for a final fitting, and the pair took a train for the French Riviera, where they spent the next few weeks vacationing and waiting for the dress to be completed. Upon returning to Paris and seeing the wedding dress, both mother and daughter were in tears at the beauty of the garment. Blinding white with delicate lace and intricate beadwork, the dress was a work of art. The décolletage was only slightly daring for the time, but the accompanying lace shawl could be used to cover the bosom if necessary. The two were in Paris for 1 more week to select shoes and the rest of her trousseau before reversing their passage and arriving back home. 3 months after they departed, the story of how the dress came to be had become an ingrained part of the oral history of Linda's family. Everyone knew the story of the Chanel wedding dress, and the legend and the dress were passed down to succeeding generations. The Chanel wedding dress had been worn by Linda's great-grandmother and then Linda's grandmother. Linda's mother had been married in the dress, and, most recently, Linda wore the dress nearly 10 years ago at our wedding. So, dresses, Letitia, are forevermore toward the grandmothers, their spirits. Emma was to be the 5th generation to wear the dress. "I can't do this," Ellen said. "Please, it is sacrilege." "Do you know Coco Chanel's history?" "I know hers is a complicated story," Ellen said. "No, it's really not. My great-grandfather flew B-17 bombers in World War II for the Army Air Corps. He had one brother who fought in the Tank Corps with General Patton in North Africa. He had another brother in the infantry in France. Both his brothers were killed in combat, and my great-grandfather was severely wounded by anti-aircraft fire. He never fully recovered from his wounds. I will never purchase a Mercedes-Benz because they manufactured engines for the enemy. I will never own a certain designer suit because they made uniforms for the enemy forces. I will never own a certain brand of computer, nor will I own stock in that company because they knowingly were complicit in supplying the enemy with punch cards and computer systems to more efficiently manage their terrible camps. Coco Chanel was a collaborator with the enemy at best, and there is strong evidence that she spied for them at worst. I don't give a darn about Coco Chanel or that dress. Ellen nodded her head sadly. I was not telling her anything she did not already know from working in the fashion industry or apprenticing at Chanel. I knew as much about Chanel as I did because I had done my research when deciding how much to insure that darned dress for Aaron. Our homeowner's policy had a special rider, insuring the Chanel dress for $150,000, 0 cents. The drawings and receipt, all authenticated and signed by Coco Chanel herself, increased the value by $100,000, 0 cents. So, the dress with accompanying documentation was insured for $250,000. If this is what you really want, then I will agree. But I think you are making a grave mistake if you want any chance of reuniting with your wife. By now it was 10 o'clock, and I had no idea what time Linda was going to grace us with her presence. I sent Ellen the remaining $2,500 and began preparing as she readied the Chanel for wear. Ellen's figure was slender and athletic. She very clearly spent a great amount of time working out. She was stunning. Ellen stepped into Linda's wedding dress and turned for me to fasten the loops in the rear. The dress predated zippers, so the enclosure was a series of loops that hooked around buttons covered in the same fabric as the dress. I put the garment bag on the floor in front of the bed, a few feet from the bedroom door where it could be seen from the doorway. "I'm not going to button the dress all the way up," I said to her as she nodded. Unsaid was the thought that she may have to undress hurriedly. Ellen had explained that during her apprenticeship at Chanel, she had been able to work closely with Karl Lagerfeld, the famous designer who had brought the Chanel brand back from the brink of death in the early 80s and returned it to the glory it had known under Coco Chanel. After 5 years at Chanel, and since her parents had passed away, Ellen had immigrated to the United States. She had sufficient savings to open her own clothes boutique on Oak Street in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood. Her boutique opened to great acclaim in February 2020, however. 1 month after her grand opening, the world went into lockdown due to the COVID pandemic. In a matter of months, Ellen lost everything, including her business, home, and car. With limited options, she made the choice that women have made for centuries, to use her assets while trying to keep some semblance of her dignity intact. She turned to escort work and had been working as a companion for 2 years to pay off her debts. She had a full-time job, which she declined to disclose to me, but she was hoping to stop doing escort work within the next 2 years. Her story was sad and certainly plausible, but I am not so naive or gullible as to believe every sad story a pretty woman tells me, especially one who makes a living playing off the feelings and emotions of men. Still, there was an air of melancholy about her as she talked to me about how she wound up alone in a hotel bar last night. She had arrived at a client's hotel room at their scheduled time. She had visited this client once before, and the experience had not been awful. Not great, but at least not awful. This time, however, when she knocked on the door of the client's hotel room, the door was flung open by a large, angry woman with makeup streaked by tears running down her face. "He doesn't need his companion today," the woman shouted at Ellen before slamming the door in her face. A shaken Ellen had wandered down to the bar to have a glass of wine and gather herself, and that is when I had noticed her. As Ellen came to sit with me on the bed, I explained the rest of the plan. We would wait for Linda to return, and when she found us together, the shock would be complete. Ellen understood her role perfectly. Under Ellen's professional guidance, we prepared for the confrontation. I had always had strong feelings for my wife, and despite worrying last night if I would ever again trust a woman, it soon became obvious that the answer was complicated. The plan was simple but effective. Ellen would play her part, and I would get my revenge on Linda for her betrayal. "Are you ready for this?" Ellen asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied. Ellen smiled sadly. "I hope you know what you're doing." "I do," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. We maintained our vigil for another hour, and my emotions were running high as I anticipated Linda's return. I had almost decided to cancel my plan when we heard the throaty roar of a sports car as it stopped in the street in front of our house. Since the driveway was taken up by Ellen's BMW, the driver had no choice but to sit at the curb. The car idled for several minutes, and my imagination was working overtime as I imagined them saying goodbye in front of our house. In front of our house, with no regard to whether the kids were home or if someone could see her and her companion. If I had any qualms about what my next steps were, they vanished. As the front door opened, Linda called out, "Jim? Emma? Tommy? I'm home. Still the same old me. Where is everyone?" Ellen gave me a reassuring look before positioning herself according to our plan, wearing the wedding dress and facing the bedroom door. "Jim? Are you back here? Whose BMW is in the driveway?" Linda shouted. I could tell by her voice that she was approaching the bedroom as Ellen and I prepared for the confrontation. "Jim, what?" was as far as Linda got before letting out a scream as she saw Ellen in the wedding dress and realized what was happening. "You terrible person!" she screamed before her mouth seemed to slam shut as she took in the full extent of what was transpiring. I could see that several things were registering on her all at once. First, the garment bag lying on the floor at the foot of the bed. Secondly, the woman who was with me was wearing her wedding dress. "Is that my wedding dress?" Linda screeched. "My precious Shanna wedding dress?" Linda's voice was almost unintelligible as she screamed her questions. I stood up as Linda watched in shock, not believing what she was seeing. Her face was purple and she seemed to be struggling to breathe. Ellen had moved away from me and was standing near the bed. I took the wedding dress from Ellen and held it up, making sure Linda could see it clearly. I then deliberately took the dress and rubbed it against various surfaces in the room, making sure to soil it thoroughly. Ellen stood and, in a move we had discussed earlier, helped me with the final part of the plan, making sure the dress was completely ruined. While Ellen was going through those motions, Linda stood in near catatonic silence and, except for her reddened face and her labored breathing, she stood stock still. I held up the wrinkled and stained dress with my left hand and, motioning with my right, I said, "See? Still the same old Chanel dress. Nothing's changed. I'm lucky because I have a wife who loves me enough to get past her hurt feelings and not make this a bigger deal than it should be." My comments echoed the nonsense that Dee had tried to sell me at the restaurant and that Linda had announced upon entering the house after her night with the jerk. Linda burst into tears and ran sobbing out of the bedroom. "Well, that was an interesting experience," Ellen said dryly. "Wasn't it, though? Let's get you ready to leave." 10 minutes later, I was escorting Ellen to her car. She reached behind my neck, pulled me in, and gave me a brief, friendly kiss, in violation of one of her rules. "In case the neighbors saw your wife this morning, that will give them something else to gossip about." Ellen gave me a grin and backed out of my driveway. I vowed to send Ellen an additional $1,000 as a bonus. She backed her BMW out of my driveway and gave me a quick wave, and Ellen Fontaine disappeared from my life forever. I could hear Linda sobbing in the living room. I sighed as I thought, no time like the present. Linda was sitting in one of the matched ivory-colored chairs that sat at 45-degree angles from each other as I took my seat in the other chair. "You destroyed my dress." Linda glared at me with hate-filled eyes. "The most precious thing I own, and you destroyed it. I guess that makes us even, doesn't it? I didn't destroy anything of yours." "Linda, the most precious thing I had were our wedding vows, our commitment to faithfulness and fidelity to each other, the promise to forsake all others. I know it was important to you, but that dress was just an object, a thing, nothing else. What you did, on the other hand, was disrespect the entire foundation of our marriage, and you did it in the most public, disrespectful manner possible. Well, you sure got even with me, didn't you? I guess you showed me," Linda snapped at me. "It was one night out of a lifetime of nights. It was one dress out of a closet full of dresses. Emma was going to be the 5th generation to wear that dress. You took that away from her. Emma was going to live in a happy home with 2 loving parents. You took that away from her. Which do you think is going to affect her the most?" Linda glared at me with an almost feral look in her eyes. "Divorce? Is that where this is going?" she hissed at me. "You'll never forgive me for what I did to that dress. And I'll never forgive you for sneaking out to be with that jerk. "You're going to work the rest of your life to pay for that dress," she shouted at me. I shook my head. "Yeah, about that. That dress is listed as a marital asset on our insurance policy, just like this chair I'm sitting on. If I want to drag this chair out to the backyard and set it on fire, I can. If I wanted to set that wedding dress on fire, I could, as long as I didn't try to file an insurance claim on it. Besides, the dress is not ruined. It's stained and damaged, and I'm sure the memories of what happened here will never go away, just like the stains we left on it." Linda burst into a fresh bout of crying at my statement. Linda had wrapped her arms around herself and was rocking back and forth as she sobbed and cried to herself. "It was just one night. It was just one night. It was just one night." 20 years later, Emma Kingsley, her husband, and her brother Tom had been working all morning placing tags on the various knickknacks, trinkets, and sundry stuff that had belonged to Emma and Tom's mother, Linda Williams. Linda had been gone for 6 months, and Emma had been dreading going through her mother's personal belongings. Emma's relationship with her mother had been complicated. After her parents' divorce, her mother seemed to go off the deep end. She had developed an almost pathological hatred for her ex-husband, claiming that he had destroyed everything precious to her. It was ironic because even at a young age, Emma knew that her mother had cheated on her father and that her father had never cheated on her mother. She knew that her father did do something that angered her mother to the point that she could no longer stay married to him, but neither Emma nor Tom knew what he had done. Linda had moved immediately into the home of a professional football player named Mark Lavalier, after it was agreed that divorce was their only path forward. It was a heady time for Linda and her children. Although Emma and Tommy had never liked Mark, he had never abused them or been unkind. They had been flown around the country to watch Mark play football, and they had been able to attend the Super Bowl, sporting events, and concerts as VIPs. Linda had quit her job to enjoy the life of being a sports star's partner, and that had lasted for nearly 2 years before Mark had grown restless and bored with Linda and asked her to leave. Jobless and homeless, Linda was forced to move into her parents' home. They had been unhappy with their daughter and her poor decisions for a long time. She had traded in a solid, loving husband for a flashy person. They were additionally discouraged by the string of unsuitable men that she became involved with after Mark, each worse than the last. Jim had been given primary custody of Emma and Tommy and stayed in the family home. Since he worked from home and provided 75% of the parenting, it was determined it would be in the best interest of the children for Jim to buy Linda out, and for him to remain in the home, more fuel for Linda's unhinged hatred of her ex-husband. 3 years after their divorce, her father had remarried. Marie Fontenot was a strikingly beautiful, dark-haired French-born woman a few years younger than her husband. Marie designed clothes and owned the Gold Coast boutique, which was the sole outlet for her designs. A year before Jim met Marie, superstar singer Tony Speed, while in Chicago to put on a concert, had wandered into Marie's boutique with a group of her friends. They had fallen in love with Marie's designs and had purchased almost the entire inventory of the boutique. When Tony was photographed in restaurants or appeared on Instagram, she gave full credit to Marie Fontenot for her look. Business had exploded, and no celebrity trip to Chicago was complete without a shopping trip to Marie's boutique. Marie had a large staff to manage the store, which let her concentrate on her designs. Emma shook her head at the memory. 17 years later, she was still amazed that her father had the nerve to strike up a conversation with the beautiful, successful clothing designer. She had no idea what Marie Fontenot saw in her dad, but marriage soon followed, with a daughter being born 6 months after Jim and Marie married. Marie had made a wonderful stepmother. She was kind, funny, and loved Emma and Tommy. She taught the two of them to speak French, and on a family vacation to France, had taken them on a tour of her hometown of Nice and the places she frequented as a girl. She then had taken them on a tour of Paris and all her old haunts. Emma adored her half-sister, Ellen, who had been given Marie's middle name. She was the best of both her father and Marie, and was a sweet, well-mannered child who followed her big sister everywhere. Emma would have liked Ellen's help today, but she knew her mother would not have approved of Ellen's help. Linda despised Marie. She always insisted that she had seen Marie somewhere before, she just could not place her face. She frequently said that Jim had probably been cheating on her all along. No one believed it because everyone in the family knew that Linda had cheated on her husband with Mark Lavilliere and had moved into his house before the divorce was even filed. It was just more evidence of Linda's pathological hatred of her ex-husband. Emma's father had wept at the funeral of his ex-wife. Marie had put her arm around her husband's waist as they stood together looking down upon Linda in her coffin. There were few mourners for Linda in the chapel. Her parents were dead, and her friends had long since abandoned her, with most drifting away after their own divorces. Linda had never remarried, and as she aged and her looks faded, she had increasingly isolated herself away from everyone but her son and daughter. Tom walked out of his mother's closet carrying an ancient white canvas garment bag with tan leather trim and matching tan leather straps and buckles holding the bag closed. Tom loosened the straps, opened the bag, and brought out a stained, wrinkled dress. The lace and beadwork on the dress were still in good shape, but the dress itself looked used and discarded. Tom asked his sister how to price the dress. When I was a little girl, Mom would talk about some special dress she had that had been in the family for a long time, but after their divorce, she never again mentioned it. I can't believe it would be that dress. If it were worth anything, she would have taken better care of it. Emma thought for a moment as she mentally calculated the value of the dress. Put a price tag of $50.00 on it, but if anyone makes an offer over $10.00, we'll take it. And so, we've reached the end of today's story. Was it what you expected, or did it take a twist you didn't see coming? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below, and let's get a conversation going. If this story kept you hooked, make sure to hit that like button. And if you're new here or just haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to join our community. I bring you fresh, captivating stories every day, so click that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.